If you're watching this at 11 p.m. because you can't sleep, I already know part of why. You're lying there running the numbers, running the years. The "am I waiting too long?" and the "am I about to move too fast?" going in circles until they blur together. Here's a story that might answer the question keeping you up. Let's call him David. He's 68. 2 years ago, he sold the family home, and everyone around him agreed it was the smart move. 6 months later, David wasn't worried about the money. He was worried about something nobody had thought to warn him about. As we go, I want you to keep asking yourself one question. What was the actual mistake? Was it selling the house? Was it the condo he bought? Was it downsizing at all? Keep guessing. I'll tell you right now, none of the obvious answers are the right one. The real one doesn't show up where you'd expect, and it isn't about a house at all. David and his wife, Susan, had 3 weeks between accepting an offer and handing over the keys. 3 weeks to decide what 30 years of a life was worth keeping. "It'll be fine," David told her, looking at boxes neither of them had opened in a decade. "We'll figure it out." They didn't. On day 19, they rented a storage unit instead and told themselves it was only temporary. It wasn't. 8 years later, David finally opened that unit again. Mold on the sofa. The dining table warped past saving. He did the math standing right there. They'd paid more to store the furniture than any of it had ever been worth. A friend of Mark's, David's son, a financial planner who's watched a lot of retirees walk this exact road, put it to David bluntly once over dinner. Most people don't lose money downsizing because they kept too much. They lose it because they never put a deadline on the box. A storage unit without an end date, he said, isn't storage. It's rent on a decision you haven't made yet. Something smaller than the sofa went out the door that same week. Susan's mother's wooden spoon, tossed into a donation box because in the middle of a ruthless decluttering mood, a spoon just looks like a spoon. She noticed it was gone 4 months later, stirring soup with one that did the job and wasn't the same spoon at all. So, was the storage unit the mistake? Close. It cost them real money, but it's not the one this story is actually about. Keep watching. By the time David and Susan needed to choose where they'd live, they were worn down the way weeks of decisions wear a person down. Their son, Mark, had already done some of the looking. "There's a condo, Dad. Move-in ready a mile from the old place. We can help you set it up this weekend." David said yes before he'd really looked at it. 3 floors. A staircase steep enough to be a problem by 78, if not sooner. "That won't happen to us," David told Susan when she asked about the stairs. He was 68. He didn't feel his age yet. The movers who hauled their furniture in that day had seen this exact rush 100 times before. One of them, waiting on a signature, told David something he didn't think much of at the time. The moves that go over budget almost never go over budget on the truck. They go over budget on the decisions people make the week before the truck shows up. David tipped him well and forgot about it for almost 2 years. 2 doors down lives a retired teacher named Walt, who made a different version of the same rushed decision, an HOA that promised to handle everything and quietly raised its fee every year instead. "I traded yard work for a part-time job and complaining," Walt tells David over coffee. So, was the condo the mistake? Not exactly. It's part of the story, but it's still not the answer. David had a workshop in the old garage for 30 years, sawdust on the concrete, tools he could find in the dark by feel alone. There wasn't room for any of it in the new place. "We'll figure that out later," he said, same as he'd said about the boxes. He didn't. 3 weeks in, everything on the checklist was done, and David couldn't explain the restless itch that wouldn't leave him alone. It was loss, wearing boredom's clothes. The regret wasn't, "I wish I'd kept more of my tools." It was, "I wish I'd made space for who I am." Susan noticed something was wrong before David did. By week 6 of the new place, she had a book club and 2 new friends. She asked David gently if he wanted to come along 1 week. "That's not really my thing, Susan," he told her, sharper than he meant to. "Some of us don't need a room full of strangers to feel fine." It wasn't true, and some part of him already knew it wasn't. He just wasn't ready to say so. So, was it the workshop? The pride? Still no. Something bigger was quietly happening underneath all of it, and David wasn't going to see it for a long time yet. Here's what we promised at the start. The storage unit, the condo, the workshop. None of it, not one bit, turned out to be David's biggest regret. David admits now that selling the house wasn't the hardest day. He was braced for that one. The hardest day came 8 months later. A Tuesday evening, alone, television on for company, when a thought stopped him mid-sentence. He realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked on his door. 3 days had passed without another person saying his name. David spent nearly 2 years believing he'd made a housing mistake. He hadn't. He'd made a time mistake. People think downsizing is about choosing the next house. It isn't. It's about protecting the last house you'll ever need to choose. So there it is. Not the storage unit, not the condo, not even the pride. The mistake was the speed, a permanent decision made in the exact week David had the least capacity in the world to think clearly, by a man who never once stopped to ask who he'd be at 78. A retired nurse in Susan's book club, someone who spent 30 years watching what isolation does to people, put it to David plainly, months later. Researchers who study aging have found that loneliness in older adults doesn't just feel bad, it measurably raises the risk of cognitive decline and dementia by a wide enough margin that doctors now treat it the way they treat a real physical risk factor, not just an unpleasant feeling to push through. David hadn't just been sad, in other words. He'd been quietly gambling with something a lot more concrete than his mood. Here's what made it worse. David didn't fix it gracefully. Instead, about 2 weeks after that Tuesday, he did something rash. Without telling Susan, he called Mark and said he wanted to sell the condo and move again, somewhere new, somewhere better, right away before he'd really thought it through. The exact same pattern, at exactly the same speed, dressed up as a solution instead of a mistake. Susan found out from Mark, not from David, and she was furious in a way David hadn't seen from her in years. "You're doing it again," she told him. "The same thing, just faster this time." She wasn't wrong. It actually changed on a Thursday, after that fight, not before it. Susan sat David down and asked something she'd clearly been holding on to for a while. "When did you stop leaving the house? And why did fixing it mean running away from this one too?" David didn't have a good answer to either half of that question. That was the answer. He didn't sell the condo. Instead, the next morning, he drove past the turn to his old coffee shop without slowing down and kept going to the storage unit he'd been meaning to finally empty. A dining table had survived, mold-free, just outdated. A young couple 2 streets over had just bought their first house. David offered it almost on impulse. The look on the wife's face did something for him he hadn't expected from a table he'd nearly written off as junk. He's given away 2 more pieces since. He told Mark, plainly, that he needed to make his own decisions from here on, including, he admitted, the decision to almost make the same mistake twice out of panic. Mark, to his credit, just listened. He showed up to Susan's book club once, uninvited, and asked if they needed a hand with chairs. He came back the next month without being asked twice. At one of those meetings, a woman named Carol mentioned quietly that she'd been widowed 3 years earlier and had 10 days, not 3 weeks, to leave a 3-bedroom house for a 1-bedroom apartment with no say in the timing at all. She mourned that house for years, always searching for somewhere called home she couldn't quite locate, until she made an even bigger move across the country near her grandchildren. 5 years later, she says she's finally home. Her story stuck with David for a different reason than he expected. If someone with far less choice than he'd had could still find her way back, his own stubbornness stopped looking like such a good excuse. David also joined a walking group that meets near Walt's building. A retired physical therapist walks with them most mornings, and she mentioned once, almost in passing, that roughly 1 in 4 people over 65 fall each year, and that falls remain the single leading cause of injury in that age group, which is exactly the kind of fact that means nothing at 68 and everything at 78. David thought about the condo stairs. He didn't move again. But he started paying attention to that staircase in a way he hadn't before. 3 days without his name being said stopped happening. Not everything got fixed. Some mornings, he still catches himself thinking about the old garage before he's fully awake. He still misses it. Probably always will. But David stopped confusing missing a house with wishing he'd stayed in it. And he stopped confusing panic with progress too, which turned out to be the harder lesson of the two. A house, he says now, was never just a roof. It was the story he lived in. He just needed a little time, one hard conversation with Susan and a knock on the right door, to realize he was allowed to keep writing it somewhere new, slowly this time. So, one last time. Was the mistake selling the house? No. The condo? No. Even David's own pride or his panicked almost second move? Not quite, though that one came close. The mistake, the whole way through, was speed, treating a life-size decision like it had to happen in a 3-week window, twice, instead of the months or years it actually deserved. David's version of understanding that took about 2 years, with a detour in the middle he's not especially proud of. Carol's took 5. Yours doesn't have to take nearly that long, now that you know which weeks to slow down in. And now that you know the fix itself can be rushed too, if you're not careful. So here's what I actually want to know, and I read every comment. When's the last time someone knocked on your door, just because? Tell me below. If any part of this landed for you, like it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.